On the night of June 5, 1944, German soldiers along the Norman countryside settled into what they believed would be just another tense but uneventful shift. For weeks they had been told again and again that the coming Allied invasion would erupt on the beaches. Every briefing, every order, every map pointed toward a seaborne assault. The Atlantic Wall, with its bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions, was where the fight would begin. No one in the German command structure imagined that an American airborne army would descend behind their lines in the dead of night. At higher headquarters, the obsession with Calais consumed planning. Officers of the 7th Army and 15th Army assumed the Allies would attack at the Straits. Normandy was considered secondary, unlikely, a diversion at best. Even those officers who feared a drop of paratroopers believed it would be small, perhaps a reconnaissance element, maybe a sabotage team of a few dozen men, not a fully equipped corps-sized airborne force, and certainly not in the weather conditions unfolding that evening. Low clouds, strong winds, and intermittent rain convinced many German commanders that no large-scale airborne operation was possible. The troops of the 709th Infantry Division, the 91st Luftlande Division, and scattered Osttruppen battalions held their sectors quietly, rifles slung, expecting only harassing patrols or the distant rumble of artillery from the coast. Yet while German soldiers tried to read the night sky for signs of Allied movement, something far larger was forming across the Channel, something unprecedented. At airfields stretching from southern England to the Midlands, 821 C-47 Skytrains prepared for takeoff, loaded with the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Engines turned over in the darkness, coughing to life one by one until the entire horizon shimmered with the roar of Pratt & Whitney radios. Pilots and crew chiefs walked around their aircraft with flashlights, checking lines, magnetos, flaps, control surfaces. Paratroopers tightened leg straps, checked static lines, and tapped each other's helmets in silent ritual. The Germans assumed the night would protect them, but in England, the night was the Allies' ally. Under cover of darkness, a force unlike anything Germany had faced was assembling. A flying armada capable of delivering 13,100 parachutists directly into the enemy's rear. When the first aircraft began rolling down the runways around 22:30, the pilots knew this was not a routine mission. It was the opening blow of Operation Overlord. The columns of C-47s were so long, so numerous, that eyewitnesses said it looked as though the sky itself was taking flight. 2 divisions worth of elite soldiers, paratroopers trained to seize bridges, crossroads, causeways, and towns vital to the invasion, were quietly lifting into the air. But across the Channel, in the hedgerows and farmhouses of Normandy, German soldiers remained unaware. Their attention was fixed on the sea. Patrols along the coast scanned the horizon for silhouettes of landing craft. At forward posts, machine gunners cleaned their MG-42s, while artillery crews reviewed firing tables. The thought that thousands of American troops could appear suddenly from the sky simply did not exist in their mental map of the battlefield. Even officers stationed inland, at Saint-Méry-Église, Carentan, Saint-Côme-du-Mont, believed they were safe from surprise. Their job was to reinforce the beaches, not defend against an airborne army. When the first distant drone of engines reached Normandy's shores, many German soldiers assumed they were hearing RAF bombers headed toward Caen or Cherbourg. They didn't know that the sound would grow louder, multiply, and eventually fill the entire sky. They didn't know that the engine noise they heard belonged to hundreds of C-47s approaching silently with their lights off, flying tight formations through cloud and anti-aircraft fire. They didn't know that the night they thought would be quiet was about to explode into chaos. To the Germans, the threat of American airborne forces felt abstract, almost theoretical. They lacked concrete intelligence on the scale, capability, or timing of Allied airborne divisions. Many didn't believe the United States had enough transport aircraft to move such a force in one night. The Wehrmacht had never faced anything like this. Yet the reality was already approaching. Hundreds of C-47s were crossing the channel in waves, engines humming in perfect cadence, their cargo doors ready to unleash an army. The sky was about to open, and the German soldiers who had been told to watch the beaches would soon discover that the invasion had bypassed them entirely, not from the sea, but from above. Shortly after 2300 on June 5, 1944, the first German troops to sense something was wrong were the radar operators along the Cotentin Peninsula. Their scopes, which normally swept empty ocean or occasional bomber streams, suddenly lit up with dozens, then hundreds of blips. At first, they assumed it was another RAF raid, but the formation was wrong. It was too low, too slow, too broad, and far too numerous. Before they could issue a clear report, the radar began to flicker from Allied jamming, and the operators lost the picture entirely. What none of them realized yet was that the largest airborne armada in the history of warfare was now only minutes away from Normandy. Across the dark sky, from horizon to horizon, lines of C-47 Skytrains stretched like glowing beads. Their formation lights were covered, only faint glimmers of exhaust and moonlight reflected off their wings. They flew in serials, long, disciplined columns, each carrying a stick of paratroopers. In total, 821 C-47s carried the men of the 82nd Airborne Division and 101st Airborne Division, while hundreds more gliders and tow aircraft followed behind. The scale was beyond anything the Germans could imagine. Witnesses on the British coast described it as an airborne river, a steel tide, a sky full of wings. The sound alone was overwhelming, the combined drone of thousands of Pratt & Whitney engines rolling across the channel like a distant storm. Inside the cockpits, pilots fought darkness, turbulence, and thick cloud banks that stretched from 500 to 1,500 feet. Many flew entirely on instruments, trying to hold formation in near-zero visibility while anti-aircraft fire began to pulse from the French coastline. The C-47s bounced violently as bursts of flak exploded around them. Some aircraft were hit, holes aunched through wings and fuselage, but they kept going. The mission was too important to break formation. Below, German troops in the 709th Infantry Division and 91st Luftland Division stared upward as the hum turned into a roar. At first, they saw nothing, just the sound of engines echoing off hedgerows and stone houses. Then the clouds thinned. Silhouettes emerged. One German sentry near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont shouted in disbelief, "Transportflugzeuge, Hunderte von ihnen." Transport aircraft, hundreds of them. Others thought it was an illusion. No one had ever seen so many planes at once, and certainly not over the interior, behind their own lines. The sky soon filled with the blinking lights of tracer rounds as German flak batteries opened fire. Searchlights stabbed upward, catching glimpses of C-47s streaking past in tight formation. In many places, the flak was so intense that aircraft were forced to break formation to avoid collisions and destruction. Pilots were trained for this moment. If split apart, they were to push ahead on approximate headings, drop zones be damned. The paratroopers would figure it out once they were on the ground. Inside the cargo bays, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Division stood in rows, hooked into static lines, swaying as the planes lurched under fire. Red lights bathed their faces. Frost and exhaust fumes seeped into the cabin. Some prayed, some stayed silent. Others clenched their teeth as the C-47s jolted violently from near misses. Officers shouted over the engine noise, 6 minutes! The paratroopers checked their gear in the drilled ritual. Leg straps, reserve chute, weapons, ammo, clicker cricket, maps of the hedgerows, and small bundles of TNT for bridges and roadblocks. Below them, German troops still could not understand what was happening. Reports crackled through field phones. Flugzeuge über Kretan, mehr über St. Maria-Église, zu viele zu zählen. Planes over Kretan, over St. Maria-Église, too many to count. Some commanders insisted it must be bombers. Others thought the Allies were performing a massive diversion. No one imagined that two entire American airborne divisions were passing overhead. At 00:15, the first green lights flipped on inside the lead C-47s. The jumpmasters shouted the command that would change the course of the invasion. Go! 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 Paratroopers began spilling out into the blackness. From the ground, German soldiers saw white blossoms erupt across the sky. Parachutes drifting down in clusters, scattered by wind and flak, forming a pattern that looked more like chaos than an organized assault. Some fell into flooded marshes. Others dropped near villages, farmhouses, and crossroads. Many landed miles off target. But to the Germans watching from below, the effect was total shock. It looked as if an entire army was materializing out of the night. Parachutes drifted over hedgerows, roads, rivers, and towns. Gunfire erupted from fields where no Americans were supposed to be. Radios failed as German units tried to report or regroup, only to realize they had no idea where the enemy was or how many there were. In the space of 15 minutes, the sky had delivered something Germany never expected, a full airborne invasion behind its coastal defenses. And the shock would only deepen once those scattered paratroopers began forming fighting units capable of tearing the Atlantic Wall apart from the inside.
The moment the first paratroopers hit the ground across the Norman countryside, the German defensive plan, every assumption, every map, every expectation, began to collapse under the wake of pure chaos. Instead of landing in neat regimental zones, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions found themselves scattered across more than 25 miles of hedgerows, orchards, marshes, and moonlit fields. Broken clouds, flak bursts, evasive maneuvers, and last-second heading changes had shredded the carefully prepared drop routes. In some serials, only a handful of paratroopers landed anywhere near the intended DZs. Others were deposited deep behind German lines or far off to the west, near flooded areas the Germans had intentionally created to deter airborne assaults. But instead of breaking the operation, this fragmentation became one of the most powerful and unexpected advantages the Allies could have asked for. On the ground, the first sounds were confusion, layered with violence. The thump of landing bodies, the crack of rifles from startled German sentries, the splash of men falling into marsh water, the metallic slap of gear as paratroopers struggled out of their harnesses. Many dropped into deep ditches filled with weeks-old stagnant floodwater. Some drowned before they could free themselves. Others crashed through trees or onto stone walls, fracturing ankles, arms, and ribs. A few were shot before they even touched the ground. And yet, scattered as they were, the paratroopers responded exactly as their training demanded. Get to cover, form a group, any group, and move toward an objective, whether original or improvised. The Germans expected paratroopers to panic if dispersed. Instead, small American units began forming within minutes. 3 men from different companies might link up and start heading toward a road junction. A squad separated from its platoon might assault a farmhouse believed to hold a radio operator. Officers and NCOs didn't wait to assemble perfect formations. They grabbed whoever they could find and moved. The doctrine drilled into every airborne soldier emphasized initiative over rigidity. If one objective was impossible, they hit another. If they couldn't find their own unit, they joined someone else's. Every paratrooper carried a map, a compass, and clear understanding of the terrain around Utah Beach and the Cotentin. German reactions varied wildly, because nothing they were seeing matched anything in their training. In the flooded fields west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, patrols from the 709th Division stumbled across clusters of paratroopers wading through waist-deep water. The sound of clicker crickets, the small signaling devices issued to the 101st, confused German soldiers who mistook the noises for insects or mechanical faults. In the darkness, Firefights erupted at point-blank range. A single squad of American airborne troops could pin down an entire German platoon simply because the Germans didn't understand the scale of the drop and feared larger enemy forces lurking nearby. Meanwhile, in Sainte-Marie-Église, disaster struck and then turned into a historic opportunity. A flare-lit house fire illuminated the entire town just as a stick of paratroopers from the 505th PIR drifted directly over the village square. German troops shot several in the air. One, John Steele, became famously snagged on the church steeple, but the rest regrouped, struck from the shadows, and by dawn had seized the town, making Sainte-Marie-Église the first liberated French town of Operation Overlord. Farther south, elements of the 101st Airborne landed near the vital causeways leading off Utah Beach. These narrow exits over marshland were essential to the seaborne troops who would land after sunrise. German strongpoints guarded them fiercely, yet scattered groups of screaming eagles moved toward the causeways instinctively, ambushing patrols, overrunning isolated machine gun nests, and cutting phone lines. Lieutenant Winters and the men of Easy Company dropped miles off target, formed an ad hoc unit, and assaulted Brecourt Manor, destroying a battery that had been shelling Utah Beach. Everywhere across the Cotentin, German units found themselves under attack from directions that made no sense. Fire came from hedgerows the Germans believed empty. Roads they expected to use for reinforcements suddenly erupted in gunfire from paratroopers who had no business being there according to German maps. Commanders attempted to send out orders, but radios jammed, wires were cut, and runners were ambushed by airborne patrols who had set up roadblocks in minutes. By 3 o'clock, the 91st Luftlandedivision Division, responsible for much of the inland defense, had lost all coherence. Its commanders didn't know where their own companies were, much less the enemy's. Reports came in describing paratroopers near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, near Neuville-au-Plan, near La Barquette, and even near areas considered impossible to reach. One officer said bitterly, "The Amerikaner fallen wie Regen." The Americans are falling like rain. And the C-47s continued to come, wave after wave, passing overhead, dropping more sticks of paratroopers in every direction. The Germans had prepared for a linear battle, for a beach assault that would sweep inland in predictable patterns. Instead, in just a few dark hours, the C-47s had delivered an entire army behind their lines, shattering any sense of control or spatial awareness. By dawn, thousands of Americans were scattered across Normandy, disorganized, bruised, often lost, but already forming lethal pockets of resistance that were cutting the German defense from the inside. The airborne invasion had not gone perfectly, but for the Germans facing this phantom army that seemed to appear everywhere, it felt as if the C-47 had torn open the very fabric of night and poured out chaos itself.
By the time the first hints of dawn began to glow along the eastern horizon on June 6, 1944, the German defensive network behind Utah Beach, once believed stable, predictable, and tightly organized, had become a maze of chaos. The drops had been scattered, units had been fractured, objectives had been confused. But the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne did what they had trained to do: operate as small, lethal, self-directed combat teams. And as these scattered elements began to converge, the German command structure began to break apart even faster. From Sainte-Marie-Église to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the night echoed with the crack of rifles, the ripping bursts of Thompson's submachine guns, and the sharp blasts of gammon bombs and TNT bundles hurled into culverts and roadblocks. German patrols that attempted to establish contact with their own companies found roads cut off by Americans who had landed hours earlier. A single squad of airborne troops could deny an entire infantry company access to a crossroads, and there were dozens of these squads, everywhere. At La Barquette Lock, a critical point controlling the floodwaters south of Cotentin, paratroopers from the 502nd PIR seized the lock after crashing through German lines in small groups. By holding it, they prevented German engineers from manipulating the marshes to isolate Utah Beach. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, but could not dislodge the small airborne force anchoring the position. Farther north, around Sainte-Mère-Église, the 82nd Airborne consolidated its hold on the town. German forces from the 91st Luftlandedivision attempted to organize counterattacks, but the paratroopers controlled the major crossroads and forced the Germans to maneuver through hedgerows under constant harassment. The mere presence of American paratroopers in the town had cut German lateral movement between Utah Beach and the interior, and the German senior commanders could not tell whether the Americans held it in platoon strength or battalion strength. They only knew the town had slipped from their grasp before daylight. The situation grew worse in the fields near Poopville and Causeway No. 1, where elements of the 101st Airborne attacked and cleared German strongpoints guarding the exits from Utah. The German defenders of WN5 and WN7 expected to hold until reinforcements arrived. Instead, paratroopers struck them from the flanks, from behind, even from inside their defensive zones, approaching through hedgerows the Germans assumed were unoccupied. These units, trained for rigid positional defense, were psychologically unprepared for enemies who materialized unpredictably, fought aggressively, and then vanished before counterfire could take effect. The Germans' attempts to restore order were hampered further by the destruction of communications. Paratroopers cut field telephone lines wherever they found them, often without knowing whom they belonged to. When German headquarters tried to issue coordinated countermeasures, dispatching the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment to reinforce the key approaches, they discovered that virtually every major road was compromised. Vehicles ran into ambushes. Mounted patrols received fire from orchards. Runners sent on foot simply disappeared. Meanwhile, hundreds of additional C-47s arrived towing Horsa and Waco gliders, carrying artillery, jeeps, anti-tank guns, and more infantry. These glider landings were costly and violent. Many pilots crashed. Many gliders broke apart, but the effect was decisive. As glider-borne units joined the battle, the scattered paratrooper groups gained firepower and cohesion. German troops, already overwhelmed by the fragmentation of their lines, now faced concentrated attacks in multiple locations simultaneously. The fear inside German units escalated rapidly. Reports of American movement poured into battalion and regimental headquarters without any coherent pattern. Fallschirmjäger bei Ecoquene, Amerikaner im Wald südlich Neuville, Straße nach Quarantan blockiert. The same German regiment might report Americans approaching from 3 different compass directions at once, not knowing those Americans belonged to different companies dropped miles apart. It created the illusion of a much larger force. When the first waves of U.S. infantry began landing at Utah Beach, they encountered only light resistance, in part because the paratroopers had already severed the German ability to organize a cohesive defense. Instead of facing intact battalions, the landing forces met small pockets of resistance, confused, isolated, and lacking support. German soldiers who survived the first chaotic hours later admitted the psychological impact was staggering. Many of them had never fought airborne troops before. They expected a few dozen saboteurs, not an entire American army. One captured German officer said, "Sie kamen von überall und nirgends," meaning they came from everywhere and nowhere. By noon on June 6th, the Germans finally understood what had happened. The C-47 Skytrains had not simply delivered paratroopers, they had delivered a battlefield nightmare, a dispersed, unpredictable, self-directing web of enemy fighters who had shredded communications, corrupted defensive lines, and crippled the German ability to stop the beach landings. What the German command had assumed was impossible had now become undeniable fact. The invasion had not begun at the beaches, but in the fields behind them, and it had arrived on wings. By the time the sun rose fully over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German commanders finally grasped the magnitude of what had happened during the night. What they had perceived as scattered enemy activity, random gunfire, and confusing reports was not chaos at all. It was the deliberate effect of 821 C-47s delivering an entire airborne army into the rear of their defensive network. In a matter of hours, the finely tuned German understanding of the battlefield had dissolved. Their units were isolated, their roads cut, their communication lines severed, and their ability to reinforce the beaches crippled precisely when the Allies needed it most. The C-47 Skytrain had rewritten the opening chapter of the invasion. As morning intensified, German attempts to counterattack collapsed under the weight of disorganization. Units from the 91st Luftlandedivision, Division, which were supposed to push towards Sainte-Mère-Église, found their routes blocked by small, aggressive bands of American paratroopers who held key hedgerows and crossroads. Orders issued from regimental headquarters arrived late or not at all. Many German platoons wandered in circles through the bocage, hearing gunfire in every direction, never sure where the front line truly was. They were fighting an enemy who could appear and disappear unpredictably, striking from orchards or ditches or road bends that had been considered safe hours earlier. Meanwhile, the airborne divisions were finally consolidating. Men who had been scattered across miles of countryside throughout the night began forming sizable companies and battalions. Medics established aid stations, officers took stock of ammunition, and runners were dispatched to link up with neighboring units. The Americans did not control every inch of ground, but they controlled everything that mattered. Bridges, road junctions, causeways, and towns essential to the flow of German reinforcements. At Utah Beach, the effect was immediate and dramatic. When the 4th Infantry Division landed, expecting fierce resistance, they discovered that many key defensive positions had already been neutralized or suppressed by airborne attacks. Machine gun nests had been flanked, anti-tank guns were silenced, and the causeways leading inland, potential death traps, were in friendly hands. German forces were unable to coordinate a counterattack because the paratroopers had severed the arteries of the German defense before daylight even touched the beaches. The Germans recognized far too late that their entire defensive concept had been outmaneuvered. The Atlantic Wall was built to stop an army coming from the sea, but in reality, the first American soldiers of the invasion had arrived behind the German lines, bypassing the bunkers, mines, and guns entirely. The C-47s had nullified months of German preparations in a single night. The psychological shock endured as the day unfolded. Prisoner interrogations revealed just how deeply the airborne assault had rattled the Germans. Many believed the Americans had landed far more troops than they actually had. Others thought the paratroopers were part of a multi-day operation rather than a single night of drops. Some units believed they were surrounded by brigades when only a handful of paratroopers were operating in the area. The illusion created by scattered drops, initially feared by Allied planners, had become a force multiplier that magnified the perceived Allied strength tenfold. As more waves of gliders and transport aircraft arrived with reinforcements and supplies, the Germans realized that they were not facing a handful of saboteurs, but a massive airborne force supported by relentless aviation. Helicopters did not exist yet. Drone resupply did not exist. But the C-47 fulfilled both roles: transport, lifeline, and symbol of Allied reach. By the end of June 6th, the paratroopers had secured Sainte-Mère-Église, blocked the German approach to Utah Beach, held the La Barquette Lock, and maintained pressure around Carentan. These achievements were not isolated tactics, they were decisive victories that ensured the larger Overlord landings would succeed. Historians would later say that if the C-47 had failed, the beaches could have turned into slaughterhouses. If the airborne drops had collapsed, Utah might have been cut off. German armor could have reached the beaches before Allied forces established defensive lines. The invasion might have faltered. The war in Western Europe might have stretched far longer. But that is not what happened. What happened was this. In the span of a few hours, under darkness and flak and clouds, the C-47 Skytrain had delivered the equivalent of a small army, 13,100 American airborne troops, into the heart of the German rear. They shattered the coherence of the defense before the first landing craft ever touched sand. They turned the Germans' greatest advantage, the Atlantic Wall, into a hollow shell by striking from the inside. By dawn, German soldiers who had spent years training to repel a frontal assault stared in disbelief at the chaos unfolding around them. The battle had not begun on the beaches as they expected. It had begun in the fields behind them, brought there by an aircraft they had underestimated, arriving in numbers they had never imagined, delivering destruction from the sky with precision and speed. For the German defenders of Normandy, it was the moment they realized the sky itself had been weaponized. And the instrument of that shock, the aircraft that brought an entire army out of thin air, was the C-47 Skytrain.